Imagine yourself settling into a quiet evening. The room is dim. Perhaps you hear the faint hum of a fan or the soft rustle of curtains. You are safe, comfortable, and ready to drift into a story that carries you far away from the present moment. Tonight, we journey into the Middle Ages. Not the world of fantasy novels or exaggerated legends, but the real medieval world that historians have slowly uncovered piece by piece. For centuries, myths and misconceptions about the medieval era have shaped how we imagine it. A time painted as dark, dirty, and brutal. An age when people supposedly thought the earth was flat, when torture devices lined every castle dungeon, and when superstition ruled every corner of daily life. But history, when patiently studied, reveals a more nuanced picture. Some myths were rooted in truth, while others were inventions of later centuries. Stories that grew taller each time they were retold. In this journey, we will move gently through 4 paths of history. First, we will sink into the rhythm of everyday life in the Middle Ages, examining what people truly believed, how they lived, and which myths have been proven or disproven. You may find yourself surprised at how much knowledge, resilience, and quiet sophistication existed in a time often dismissed as backward. Then, we will follow a thread of devotion and ritual, entering the solemn world of the Knights Templar. Their initiation ceremonies, so often clouded in mystery and rumor, were in reality a careful blend of discipline, community, and sacrifice. Imagine yourself watching a young knight candidate kneel before his brothers, taking vows that would bind him for life. From there, we will travel southward to the Roman town of Pompeii, where a very different kind of structure reveals itself, the lupanar or brothel, preserved in volcanic ash. It provides a candid window into the economic and social realities of ancient life, where stone beds and painted frescoes told stories as vividly as any chronicle. Finally, we will move into the Spartan world, where even marriage was not a private affair, but a state-controlled institution designed to shape citizens for war. Here, discipline permeated family life, and rituals were woven into the survival of the polis. Each segment will unfold slowly, with detail and care. The myths we untangle, the rituals we uncover, the forgotten realities we restore. All of these are offered not with urgency, but with calm reflection. As you listen, allow your mind to wander. Let the stories wash over you like a quiet tide, carrying you into sleep if that is where you wish to go, or simply into a deeper stillness if you remain awake. History, after all, is not always about battles and bloodshed. Sometimes, it is about noticing the quiet truths hidden beneath centuries of misunderstanding. And tonight, we will walk gently together into those truths, one myth at a time. Imagine yourself stepping into a medieval town. The cobblestone streets are uneven beneath your feet, and timber-framed houses lean slightly, their upper floors jutting out over narrow lanes. There is chatter in the air, a murmur of merchants bargaining, women drawing water from a well, and clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from somewhere nearby. The smell is a mixture: smoke from hearth fires, the tang of salted fish, the earthy scent of animals. Already, you are immersed in a place that feels familiar from storybooks and films. Yet much of what we believe about this world is shaped more by myth than by fact. Take, for instance, the old claim that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. It is an image we inherit from modern caricature. The medieval peasant gazing at the horizon, fearing that ships might tumble into a void. In truth, the idea of a flat earth was rarely held in the medieval West. As early as the writings of Bede in the 8th century, scholars acknowledged the earth's roundness. The works of Aristotle, translated into Latin, taught the same, and sailors navigating by stars knew it instinctively. What varied was not the shape of the world, but the scale of it, the unknown distances of oceans, the mysterious land beyond. So when you imagine a medieval scholar peering at the sky, see him not as naive, but as cautious, aware of mysteries, but not blind to the earth's round form. Another persistent myth paints medieval cities as cesspools of filth, where people never bathed and streets reeked constantly. To be sure, sanitation was far from modern standards. Chamber pots were emptied into alleys, and animals mingled freely with humans. Yet, bathing was not absent. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, modeled after Roman traditions, though by the late Middle Ages, Some had declined in use due to associations with disease or immorality. Wealthier households might have wooden tubs filled with warmed water, perfumed with herbs like lavender or rosemary. The scent of soap made from tallow or olive oil was known. Hygiene was not non-existent. It was simply practiced differently, with rhythms shaped by the seasons, by access to clean water, and by beliefs about health and humors. Imagine yourself in a wooden tub, steam rising in a dimly lit room, a candle flickering, the scent of herbs masking the roughness of the day. That, too, was medieval life. The myths often sharpen when it comes to medicine. We tend to imagine barber surgeons hacking crudely at limbs, or physicians muttering over leeches. Yet medieval medicine, though imperfect, was not devoid of sense. The humoral theory, drawn from Galen, emphasized balance, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and treatments often sought to restore equilibrium. Herbs like sage, mint, and chamomile were cultivated in cloister gardens, their uses cataloged in manuscripts. Surgery existed, too, practiced with surprising precision for wounds and fractures. Anesthetics were crude, opium, mandrake, or alcohol, but not unknown, of course. There were failures, and many ailments lay beyond their knowledge, but to dismiss it as ignorant overlooks the care and observation embedded in their practices. When plague or fever struck, remedies might fail, but the attempt to heal, to comfort, to understand, those were very human constants. Then there's a myth of the Iron Maiden, the fearsome torture device lined with spikes, ready to pierce a victim shut inside its coffin-like embrace. It looms in modern imagination as a symbol of medieval cruelty. But the truth is simpler. The Iron Maiden is a fabrication of the 18th and 19th centuries, assembled from earlier artifacts and fueled by sensationalist interest in medieval horror. Real medieval punishments were harsh: stocks, whipping, execution. But the Iron Maiden, as popularly imagined, never stood in a dungeon in those centuries. Museums displayed them later as curiosities, not as relics of medieval justice. Picture a quiet hall of a 19th century exhibition, where visitors whispered in both awe and fear at the sight of a spiked sarcophagus, believing it to be authentic. The myth had taken root, but history reveals its later invention. Other myths spring from exaggeration. Robin Hood, for example, often appears in our minds as a single outlaw, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, cloaked in green in Sherwood Forest. In truth, the figure likely emerged from a patchwork of ballads, inspired by several real outlaws across centuries, each retelling added details. The loyal merry men, the noble cause, the rivalry with the sheriff of Nottingham. He was thus a single man, then a mirror of popular hopes and frustrations. Imagine hearing his story sung in a tavern, the air thick with ale and smoke, voices rising in chorus. Robin Hood became real not by fact, but by collective imagination. Even symbols like the Black Knight carry misunderstood weight. To us, the phrase conjures images of sinister armored figures, lurking in shadow. Yet, in medieval heraldry, the term simply referred to the color of one's coat of arms, not a moral judgment. A knight bearing sable or dark symbols was not inherently villainous. In stories, black might lend mystery, but in practice, it was merely another hue in a complex code of identity. And then there were the peculiar customs, like the so-called trial by holy bread. In certain cases, accused individuals might be required to chew and swallow consecrated bread, under the belief that guilt would prevent them from doing so without choking. Strange to modern ears, yes, but to medieval minds, it was a way of merging faith with justice, of letting the divine act where human knowledge faltered. It was less spectacle than ritual, carried out with solemnity, and often with the quiet fear that faith itself was being tested. When you step back, you begin to see how myths form. Some emerge from misunderstanding, others from exaggeration, and some from later invention. The Middle Ages were indeed marked by hardship, but they were also times of learning, adaptation, and resilience. To imagine the medieval world only as dark is to miss the glimmers of light. The scholars reading Aristotle, the herbalists tending their gardens, the ballads weaving legends, the rituals blending faith and justice. As you wander through this imagined town, the myths dissolve into subtler truths. Life was difficult, yes, but it was also textured, layered with belief, hope, and daily rhythm. People sought meaning as we do, and their world was no more naive than ours, only shaped by different tools, different fears, and different ways of knowing. Now, let us linger a little longer in this medieval town and follow the rhythms of its daily life. The myths often insist that medieval people lived in constant ignorance, stumbling through a world of superstition without reason. Yet, if you pause to observe them closely, you notice something different. Knowledge was present, just expressed in forms unlike our own. Take the question of superstition. Yes, charms were carried, prayers were murmured, and omens were noted. But these were not marks of blindness. Rather, they were part of a worldview where the sacred and the natural were intertwined. A farmer studying the skies might read the movement of birds as a sign, but he also knew the soil, the seasons, and the habits of his crops. A woman brewing a potion for her child's fever might add a whispered blessing, but her recipe came from generations of observation. Chamomile to soothe, mint to ease the stomach, honey to coat the throat. Faith and reason did not exist in opposition. They braided together, forming a way of life both practical and spiritual. One of the most vivid myths is the dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518, where hundreds supposedly danced uncontrollably in the streets until some collapsed or even died. For a long time, the story was dismissed as legend, an exaggeration of mass hysteria. Yet historical records confirm that something did happen. Men and women indeed danced for days on end, though the causes remain debated. Some scholars suggest ergot poisoning caused by mold in damp rye bread, which can induce hallucinations. Others point to stress and famine, where collective anxiety found release in frenzied movement. Imagine yourself on a summer day in Strasbourg, the sun hot on cobblestones, as a crowd gathers, music swelling, bodies swaying not with joy but with compulsion. To bystanders it must have been both mesmerizing and frightening, a reminder that myth sometimes grows from events too strange to fully explain. Another unusual practice often recounted with disbelief is that of animal trials. In medieval courts, animals accused of crimes, pigs that killed children, rats that damaged crops, were sometimes put on trial, complete with legal defense and formal judgment. At first glance, it seems absurd, a caricature of justice. But seen through medieval eyes, it reveals a world where the law sought cosmic order. If a creature disrupted that order, then even it must face judgment. Imagine a solemn courtroom, robed judges, and a pig tethered before them while a lawyer makes arguments on its behalf. It was less about the animal, and more about reaffirming the moral structure of society, binding human life to divine justice in every corner of existence. Medicine, too, carried stories that blur the line between myth and fact. Consider the figure of the plague doctor, often depicted with a beak mask stuffed with herbs. Many believe these doctors roamed the streets during the Black Death of the 14th century, but in truth, the costume emerged later, in the 17th century, during the medieval plague. Physicians did visit the sick, but their clothing was less dramatic, long robes, hoods, and cloth coverings. Still, the idea of purifying the air with herbs was not without sense. They feared miasma, the bad air thought to spread disease, and aromatic plants offer a form of comfort, if not cure. The myth of the beak doctor became a symbol of the age, but the reality was more modest, more desperate, yet still rooted in attempt to care. And what of daily nourishment? The myth often suggests that medieval diets were bland, monotonous, and meager. While scarcity was real, food culture was surprisingly varied. Grains formed the staple. Rye, barley, wheat were possible, but they were accompanied by pottage, a stew of vegetables, and sometimes meat. Herbs and spices, imported through trade routes, flavored the tables of the wealthy, while common folk relied on leeks, onions, garlic, and mustard seeds. Fish was central, especially during religious fasting days. Ale and cider were drunk daily, often safer than water, and bread came in many forms, from coarse black loaves to refined white bread reserved for lords. Picture yourself in a humble cottage, a pot bubbling over a fire, the scent of cabbage and turnip mingling, a crust of bread torn and dipped. This was a rhythm of sustenance, plain, perhaps, but far from the starvation often imagined. The myth of medieval darkness, both literal and figurative, also needs untangling. Nights were lit by tallow candles, rushlights, and hearth fires. Streets in larger towns sometimes had watchmen carrying lanterns. True, shadows were deep and winter nights long, but people adapted. Eyes adjusted, ears sharpened, and life continued in the quiet of candlelit rooms. Darkness was not always feared. It was part of the rhythm of life, a time for stories, prayers, and rest. Imagine sitting by a fire, the flicker of flame casting gentle shadows on a timber wall, as someone recites a ballad or scripture. It was a darkness softened by human presence, not the void we sometimes imagine. Education, too, holds myths. It is often said that medieval people were literate, but literacy varied widely. Monks and clergy were trained to read and copy manuscripts, producing illuminated texts whose colors still shine today. Merchants needed basic numeracy and literacy for trade, and town schools existed for the children of artisans and burghers. Women, especially of noble birth, were sometimes educated in letters and music. While not universal, literacy was not absent. It was growing, spreading slowly with each generation. The myth of a wholly illiterate society overlooks the quiet scratch of quills in monasteries, the tallying of accounts in ledgers, and the recitation of prayers memorized but also read from parchment. Through all of this, what we find is a world both harsher and more human than myth suggests. The people of the Middle Ages were not caricatures of ignorance, but men and women negotiating survival, meaning, and hope with the tools they had. Their myths, our myths about them, tell us less about their lives and more about how later centuries chose to remember them. As you continue to wander through this imagined town, you sense the blend of truth and legend, the flat earth, the filth, the Iron Maiden, the ever-ignorant peasant, all fade into subtler shades of reality. Instead, you notice knowledge carried quietly, rituals blending faith and reason, diets that nourish, and nights lit with story and fire. The myths dissolve, and what remains is a rhythm of life both ordinary and extraordinary, distant yet deeply familiar. Imagine yourself now leaving the bustle of the town and walking into the countryside. The air feels fresher here, carrying the smell of tilled earth and cut hay. Fields stretch wide, dotted with peasants bent over their work, their hands roughened by labor. The countryside, too, is tangled in myths. We often imagine it as a place of endless toil, mud, and silence. Yet, while hardship was real, rural life contained rituals, community, and small joys often overlooked. One myth insists that peasants lived their entire lives in despair, oppressed without respite. But listen closely to the sound of a village, laughter, children chasing each other, the rhythmic thud of a flail beating grain, the singing of women as they spin wool together. Work was constant, yes, but it was shared. Fields were plowed collectively, harvests brought in with neighbors lending hands, and festivals punctuated the year with song and dance. Imagine standing in a village green during a midsummer celebration, garlands of flowers, a fiddler striking a tune, feet stamping on the ground in rhythm. These moments, woven into the fabric of the year, soften the edges of struggle. The myth of medieval people being exceptionally short, hunched, and sickly also deserves nuance. Archaeological studies of skeletons reveal that average heights were not drastically lower than today. Men often sit around 5 feet 7 inches, women about 5 feet 3. Nutrition varied with class and harvest, so some suffered stunted growth, but others thrived. A peasant child raised on hearty porridge, milk, and occasional meat could grow strong, though vulnerable to famine years. Health challenges were real, but to imagine a world only of hunched, frail figures is to exaggerate. Bodies bore the marks of labor, but they also carried resilience. Another common myth paints medieval society as stagnant, unchanging for centuries. Yet, even in the countryside, innovations quietly reshaped life. The heavy plow, with its iron blade, allowed deeper cultivation of northern soils. The three-field system rotated crops, improving yields. Windmills and watermills appeared, harnessing nature to grind grain, press oil, and cut wood. These changes unfolded slowly, almost unnoticed by those living through them, but they marked progress. Imagine the steady creak of a watermill wheel turning, day after day, its rhythm blending with the river's song. Innovation woven into the natural landscape. Religion, too, is wrapped in myth. We imagine medieval villagers living in fear of the church, crushed by superstition and dogma. In reality, the parish church was both a place of faith and a center of community. Its bells marked the hours, its festivals gave rhythm to the seasons, and its rituals framed life from birth to death. While fear of sin and salvation shaped minds, the church also offers stability, connection, and beauty. Candles lit on winter mornings, hymns echoing through stone walls, stained glass casting colored light. All of these provided comfort. Imagine kneeling in such a church, the coolness of stone beneath your hands, the faint scent of incense drifting. It was both sacred space and familiar gathering place. Education about the natural world was not absent in these villages either. Farmers knew the phases of the moon and their effect on planting. Shepherds recognized herbs to treat sheep, and women passed down midwifery practices through generations, though lacking microscopes and modern chemistry. Their knowledge was rooted in observation, trial, and memory. It was a science of the senses, not written in books but carried in practice. Another myth often tells us that medieval people rarely traveled, bound to their villages for life. Yet seasonal movement was common. Peasants went to market towns, pilgrims journeyed to shrines, merchants passed through villages, and laborers sometimes sought work elsewhere. While most lives remained local, horizons were not as narrow as we might think. Imagine a pilgrim passing through, a staff in hand, a shell pinned to his cloak, heading for Compostela or Canterbury. His presence connected the quiet village to a wider world of roads and stories. And what of women in these communities? Myth often cast them as silent, powerless figures. Reality was more varied. Women worked alongside men in fields, managed households, and in some cases inherited land or managed estates when husbands were absent. A widow could run a tavern or a workshop. Midwives held respective roles, guiding births with both skill and ritual. True, restrictions existed and patriarchy shaped norms, but to erase women's agency is to flatten history. Imagine a village woman balancing a child on her hip while bargaining in the market, her voice firm, her presence central to family and economy alike. The rhythms of rural justice also differed from the myths. Not every crime led to brutal punishment. Local disputes were often resolved through fines, negotiations, or public apologies. Stocks and pillories were real, but they were as much about shaming as physical harm. A thief might stand in the village square, mocked by neighbors as crime announced, but then he returned to life among them. Harshness existed, but so did pragmatism. In the countryside, knights carried their own myths. We often picture villagers terrified of the dark, haunted by superstition. Yet darkness was a companion as much as a fear. Families gathered by fire, told stories of saints and spirits, shared folktales of tricksters and ghosts. Children listened wide-eyed, but the stories bound them to community memory. Darkness was not silence, but a canvas for imagination. Imagine lying on straw bedding, hearing a grandfather tell a will-o'-the-wisp dancing in the marsh, fear and wonder mingling in the flicker of firelight. So as you walk back through these fields and cottages, you see how myths blur truth. Peasants were not hopeless drudges, nor was the countryside a frozen world of ignorance. Instead, it was alive with rhythm, work and festival, hardship and laughter, tradition and quiet innovation. These people knew more than myths allow, traveled farther than we assume, and carried lives textured with resilience and community. History's myths simplify, but reality complicates. And in that complication, the medieval world becomes less distant, more human, its heartbeat steady beneath the weight of time. Now, let us complete our walk through the myths of medieval daily life. You have wandered through towns and villages, heard the laughter of peasants and the chanting of priests, and seen how myth and reality often intertwine. This final step brings together smaller threads, those lingering images that still cling stubbornly to our imagination. One of the most persistent is the idea that medieval people never smiled, their lives so grim that joy was absent. Yet art and manuscripts show otherwise. Marginalia, the whimsical doodles in the margins of illuminated texts, reveal humor, rabbits jousting, monkeys playing instruments, and peasants grinning in mischief. Festivals brought moments of revelry where masks were worn, plays performed, and roles reversed. Even in hardship, laughter found its place. Imagine a scribe pausing in his solemn work, sketching a tiny creature in the corner of a manuscript, is private joke preserved for centuries. Another myth paints the Middle Ages as a time without romance or affection, marriages being purely practical arrangements. While it is true that many unions were shaped by family or property, the language of courtly love flourished. Troubadours sang of devotion, knights pledged themselves to ladies, and poetry spoke of longing. Love did not vanish. It simply found its voice in forms shaped by custom. Imagine sitting in a candlelit hall, a lute strumming as a song of yearning drifts through the air. The myth of lovelessness fades into a softer truth. Affection existed, woven into music and story. Education, too, is often misunderstood. It is said that medieval schools were rare and backward. Yet cathedral schools trained generations in grammar, rhetoric, and logic, laying foundations for universities that endure today. Paris, Bologna, Oxford. Students debated Aristotle, copied manuscripts, and sometimes rioted with youthful energy. Knowledge was not absent. It was alive, if limited to certain circles. Picture young scholars huddled in a chilly hall, scratching notes by candlelight, their breath visible in the cold. They dreamed not of ignorance, but of wisdom, even if bounded by the horizons of their age. Consider also the myth that medieval people lived only to about 30. While average life expectancy was indeed low, this was largely due to infant mortality and disease. Those who survived childhood could live into their 50s or 60s, sometimes longer. Villages had elders who remembered 3 generations, and chronicles mention men and women reaching ages we would recognize today as old. Imagine an elderly woman by a hearth, her hands wrinkled, her voice steady as she tells children of the past. She is proof that age was not denied to all. Then there is a myth of constant violence, of swords forever drawn, and streets always dangerous. Yet for most, daily life was not spent in battles, but in ordinary tasks. Wars came and went, bandits threatened, but many days passed in plowing, weaving, mending, and trading. Violence touched lives, yes, but it did not consume every moment. Imagine a market square on a quiet afternoon. Stalls of cheese, pottery, wool, neighbors greeting one another. This, too, was the Middle Ages, not only blood and steel, but bread and barter. Even the image of gloom is exaggerated. We think of endless gray skies, dark castles, and damp stone, but colors filled the medieval world. Stained glass cast vibrant blues and reds. Clothing was dyed in bright yellows, greens, and crimsons when resources allowed, and manuscripts glowed with gold leaf. Festivals filled towns with banners, music, and pageantry. Imagine the blaze of color on a feast day, banners rippling in the wind, bells ringing. The myth of monochrome gives way to a spectrum of life. Finally, there is a lingering myth of medieval stagnation, that people lived without curiosity, waiting passively for the Renaissance to awaken them. But curiosity was never absent. Pilgrims traveled across Europe, merchants sailed to distant shores, scholars debated philosophy, and builders raised cathedrals whose arches still defy imagination. The world was not static. It pulsed with inquiry and movement, even if slowly by modern measure. Imagine standing in the nave of a cathedral under construction, the air filled with dust and hammering, stone rising toward heaven. This was ambition and creativity, alive in its own time. As the myths dissolve, what remains is a picture both more ordinary and more profound. Medieval life was not a flat caricature of ignorance, filth, and cruelty. It was a tapestry of hardship and humor, fear and faith, routine and ritual. The people of those centuries carried burdens, but they also sang, laughed, dreamed, and loved. And so, as you step back from this imagined journey, you find yourself with a gentler understanding. The myths we inherit are not meaningless. They tell us something about how later generations viewed the past, what they feared, and what they wanted to believe. But beneath them lies a world more textured, more human. The rhythm of medieval life, its work, its rituals, its myths and truths, was steady, persistent, enduring. It invites us not to scoff at the dark ages, but to listen, to see, and to recognize in them reflections of ourselves. Imagine yourself standing before a stone fortress at dawn. The air is cool, still heavy with night silence, yet already charged with anticipation. Within these walls, men from across Christendom gather, drawn not by wealth or comfort, but by vows they are prepared to take. vows that will bind them for life. These are the Knights of the Temple, known simply as the Templars. Their reputation, both feared and revered, has echoed through centuries, wrapped amidst of secrecy, treasure, and forbidden rituals. Yet the reality of their initiation was less sensational and more profound, a blend of discipline, humility, and communal faith. The Order of the Knights Templar was founded in the early 12th century during the fervor of the Crusades. Their mission was simple in statement but vast in duty, to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, they grew into one of the most powerful military orders of the medieval world, commanding respect from kings and suspicion from rivals. But at the heart of their strength lay a code, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that each knight swore upon entry. These vows did not elevate the individual, but stripped him of self, binding him into brotherhood. Picture a young man arriving at the fortress gates. Perhaps he is of noble birth, trained in arms, but weary of worldly pursuits. He has heard of the Templars' discipline, their fierce devotion, their austere way of life. To enter is no simple matter. He must petition for admission, declaring his desire to dedicate himself to God through the order. His lineage is considered, his reputation weighed, for not all are accepted. The process is careful, designed to filter those who seek only glory or wealth from those ready to surrender both. When the day comes for his initiation, he does not stride into a hall with fanfare. Instead, he is led to a small chapel, its walls lit only by flickering candles. The air is hushed, heavy with the smell of wax and stone. Brothers of the order stand in silence, their white mantles marked with the red cross draped over their shoulders. The atmosphere is solemn, not theatrical, an environment meant to remind a candidate of the seriousness of what he is about to embrace. The ceremony begins with questioning. The master or a senior officer addresses the candidate directly. Does he truly understand the weight of what he seeks? Is he prepared to live without wealth, to forsake marriage and family, to obey commands even when they lead to hardship? The questions are not perfunctory. They press deeply, giving the candidate one last chance to step away. It is said that some did turn back, realizing that the life of a Templar was not one of honor without cost, but of sacrifice without guarantee of earthly reward. For those who remain, the vows follow. The candidate kneels, a gesture of humility, and places his hands between those of the master. He swears to live in chastity, giving up the possibility of wife and children. He swears to poverty, owning nothing beyond what the order provides. And he swears obedience, promising to follow commands with faith, whether they lead to comfort or to death on a distant battlefield. These words bind him, not to a dream of adventure, but to a discipline as strict as any monastery, joined to the sword. Once the vows are taken, the mantle is bestowed. A white cloak is draped over his shoulders, signifying purity, marked with a simple red cross, the emblem of sacrifice, of willingness to shed blood in defense of faith. It is a powerful moment, yet understated. There is no grand spectacle, only the quiet weight of cloth, the flicker of candles, the silence of brothers acknowledging one more soul bound to their cause. Imagine yourself watching from a corner of that chapel, the way the new knight bows his head as the mantle rests upon him, the way the circle of Templars closes around him in acceptance. Afterward, there is no feast of indulgence. Instead, he joins a communal meal, bread, wine, perhaps simple meat or broth, taken in silence or accompanied by scripture. The transition is immediate. He is no longer an individual, but part of a body governed by rule and prayer. Even in dining, discipline prevails. Meals are eaten in common, often accompanied by readings, a reminder that sustenance is both physical and spiritual. The initiation concludes with blessings, prayers invoking God's guidance, and embrace of brotherhood. The new knight is now one among many, indistinguishable in mantle and duty. His former wealth, if any, may be transferred to the order, not for his gain, but for the collective mission. His life is now marked by routine, prayer at fixed hours, training with sword and horse, guarding roads, defending fortresses, and above all, obedience to the call of his master. What strikes you, if you pause to reflect, is how the ceremony avoids spectacle. Later centuries imagined Templar initiations as scenes of dark oaths, strange rituals, and hidden blasphemies. But the reality attested in records, was rooted in solemn Christian devotion and monastic discipline. It was not secrecy that defined the Templars, but seriousness. Their initiation was less about mystery and more about surrender, of will, of comfort, of self. And so, as you leave that imagined chapel, you carry with you the sense of gravity that pervaded the ritual. It was not a performance, but a passage. A man entered as himself. He left as a brother, cloaked in white and red, bound by vows that would guide him until death. Imagine the days that followed the ceremony. The new brother, once accustomed to the freedoms of noble life, now awakened to the sound of bells. Each hour is measured not by personal desire, but by duty. The life of a Templar was a fusion of monk and soldier, an existence bound equally to prayer and to arms. And the initiation was only the beginning, a doorway into a rhythm of discipline that would define every day. At dawn, prayers are recited. The brothers rise together, their voices blending in psalms, echoing through the stone halls of commandery. Candles flicker, smoke drifts upward, and the words of scripture set the tone for the day. From there, duties unfold, tending the horses, sharpening weapons, repairing gear, and training in formation. Though legends remember the Templars for their martial skill, it was their discipline, born from vows, that made them formidable. Imagine rows of knights drilling in silence, the sound of hooves pounding the earth in unison, a choreography of obedience more powerful than raw strength. Meals, too, carried ritual. Brothers ate together, often in silence, while a designated reader recited scripture aloud. Bread and wine, sometimes accompanied by vegetables or meat, sustained their bodies while words nourished their spirits. The new knight learned that eating was not indulgence of service, a reminder that even the simplest act was part of a larger devotion. Contrast this with the noble feasts of his past, where banquets overflowed with roasted game and song. Here, in the Templar Hall, simplicity reigned. It was not meant to diminish, but to unify, reminding each man that he was one part of a whole, his body strengthened only so it might serve. The rules of the order extended into every corner of life. Clothing was plain, marked only by the Red Cross. Horses, essential companions in both travel and battle, were cared for with reverence. Brothers were forbidden from hunting for sport, from gambling, from idle chatter. Even laughter was regulated, for discipline required control of the tongue as much as a sword. Imagine the weight of such restraint. A life pared down, stripped of ornament, lived in obedience. For some, this discipline was suffocating. For others, it was freedom, the release from vanity, from the endless pursuit of wealth or pleasure. The initiation ritual itself reflected this ethos. Before being accepted, a candidate was warned that the life ahead was hard. He would be expected to sleep clothed, ready at any moment to rise for duty. He would fight not for personal glory, but for the defense of pilgrims, the poor, and the church. He would be sent to distant lands, perhaps never to return. And yet, once vowed, he could not leave lightly. The brotherhood was permanent, its bonds unbreakable save by death or expulsion for grave fault. Over time, the initiation acquired an aura of secrecy. Later accusations, especially during suppression of the order in the early 14th century, painted the rituals as blasphemous. Spitting on the cross, renouncing Christ, obscene kisses. These charges, brought forth under torture, were part of a campaign to dismantle the Templars, whose wealth and independence had grown threatening to kings. But records of the actual ceremonies show nothing of the sort. They were austere, Christian, solemn. The myths of heresy were shadows cast by politics, not by the rituals themselves. Consider the symbolism of the mantle. White for purity, red for sacrifice. When draped across the shoulders of a new knight, it was not merely clothing but identity. The mantle erased individuality, making each brother indistinguishable from the next. To put it on was to die to the world and live only for the order. Imagine the sensation, the ruffle against skin, the weight of fabric reminding the knight of his new station, the knowledge that he now belonged entirely to something greater than himself. The ceremony also underscored humility. A candidate, no matter how noble, entered on equal terms with others. Wealth, title, and birth mattered little once vows were spoken. Within the order, the master's command outweighed the pride of lineage. This leveling was radical in a world where hierarchy governed every interaction. Imagine a bear and son kneeling beside a knight of lesser birth, both clothed alike, both bound by the same words. The ritual stripped away distinctions, forging unity from diversity. Beyond the chapel walls, the world often misunderstood the Templars. Their secrecy, necessary for discipline and strategy, invited speculation. Their wealth, accumulated through donations and banking, provoked envy. Their independence from secular rulers drew suspicion. But within, the reality was structured and consistent, a life ordered by prayer, rule, and vow. The initiation ritual, far from being a cult, was simply the gateway into this pattern. Think of the young knight, rising the morning after his vows. His life is no longer his own. His horse awaits in the stable. His sword hangs ready. His brothers surround him in silence. He is bound by obedience, chastity, and poverty. The vows echo still in his ears, each word a tether to discipline. And those centuries later myths would paint the Templars as keepers of hidden treasures and forbidden rites. The truth of his initiation is simpler. It was about surrender, not to mystery, but to devotion. As you step quietly from this imagined hall, you carry with you the image of that ritual. Dim light, whispered vows, the weight of cloth, the silence of brothers. It was not spectacle that made the Templars powerful, but the unseen strength of discipline. The invisible chain that bound each man to his cause. Imagine yourself traveling eastward with the newly initiated knight. His vows are still fresh, the white mantle stiff upon his shoulders, the red cross stark against its folds. The road stretches long before him, leading to the Holy Land, where the Order's mission is most urgent. This journey itself was a continuation of initiation, for it tested endurance, obedience, and faith. The ritual of vows within the chapel was but the beginning. The true initiation unfolded across years of discipline and service. On the road, the brother learns quickly that his life belongs not to himself. His companions are his constant company, their movements governed by the same rules, their speech tempered by the same silence. When the Order traveled, they moved like a single body. Their horses cared for with diligence, their supplies managed with precision. No knight dined lavishly. No one carried possessions beyond what was granted. Poverty was not only a vow but a reality. Personal wealth was surrendered to the Order, and whatever riches a man once had were now property of the Brotherhood. Imagine a nobleman who once feasted in a hall, now eating simple bread beneath an open sky, his silver goblets replaced by wooden bowls. The vow of chastity. 2. Shaped life profoundly. Unlike monks cloistered away, Templars lived in the world, surrounded by temptations. Markets bustled with women and families. Inns offered pleasures of food and flesh. Yet the knight was bound to abstain. The mantle marked him as one set apart, visible to all, a symbol of renunciation. In battle, this vow was a source of strength, freeing him from ties that might weaken resolve. But in private moments, the cost was real. Loneliness, the ache of what had been surrendered. The ritual that forbade marriage and family was not abstract. It marked every day that followed. The vow of obedience was perhaps the heaviest. It was said that a Templar must obey as swiftly as a corpse responds to the hands of one who moves it, utterly without resistance. Orders came from the master or commanders, and they were followed without hesitation. In this, the knights will surrender at the chapel altar and lived out in daily life. If commanded to ride into danger, he rode. If commanded to guard quiet road for weeks, he waited. Imagine the stillness of Watchtower at night. The knight pacing the battlements, eyes straining into the dark, fulfilling his obedience not with glory but with quiet patience. Over time, the initiation ceremony acquired myths of secrecy. Some said that brothers whispered hidden words, that strange gestures bound them in loyalty beyond Christian faith. But the truth of the ritual was plain. Vows spoken, mantle bestowed, prayers offered. What gave rise to suspicion was not the ceremony itself, but the Order's growing power. Wealth flowed into Templar hands, not for personal use but for the Order's coffers. They became bankers for kings, guardians of treasure, managers of estates. This prosperity, combined with secrecy, sparked envy. Enemies painted the initiation as sinister, imagining rites of heresy and corruption. Yet the reality, as attested by contemporary sources, was humility, prayer, and obedience. To the new knight, the memory of initiation was both burden and comfort. In moments of fear, on the battlefield, facing Saracen cavalry, he could recall the vows spoken in candlelight, the mantle draped upon him, the prayers of his brothers. That memory steadied him, reminding him that he fought not for himself but for God and the order. Imagine the dust of battle rising, the clash of steel, the cries of war. Amid that chaos, the knight's heart might return to the stillness of the chapel, to the moment of surrender, finding strength in its discipline. The structure of the initiation also emphasized community. No man joined the order for individual glory. The ritual was designed to strip away ego, to make each knight equal. They dined alike, dressed alike, fought alike. Even burial reflected this equality. When death came, knights were often laid in simple graves, their mantles their only shroud. The initiation was, in a sense, preparation for such an end, a rehearsal for dying to the world, so that life could be devoted wholly to faith and service. And so, when you reflect on initiation, you see its purpose was not spectacle, but transformation. It was not the momentary drama of vows, but the lifelong shaping of a man into a brother, obedient and disciplined. Later centuries may have painted it in colors of mystery and scandal, but within the candlelit chapel, the reality was plain. Humility, discipline, surrender. As you imagine leaving that fortress, perhaps you glance back at the chapel door. Behind it, countless men have knelt, spoken vows, and risen changed. Their lives carried forward the weight of that ritual, each day an extension of the promises made. And though myths would later surround the Templars with shadows, the heart of their initiation remains clear. Not secrecy, but sacrifice. Now let us return once more to that chapel, where the ceremony began. The candles have burned lower, their light wavering on the stone walls, and the new knight, once simply a man, now rises as a brother of the temple. This final reflection on initiation is not about the ritual itself, but about what it meant both to those within the order and to those outside who watch with fascination, suspicion, or fear. The vows spoken in quiet sanctity were never intended to be secrets. Poverty, chastity, and obedience were the same vows binding monks across Christendom. What set the Templars apart was that their monastery had no cloister walls. Their prayers were offered in chapels, but also on horseback, on battlefields, and along pilgrim roads. Their poverty was real, stripping them of personal wealth. Yet the order as a whole grew wealthy through gifts and service. Their chastity bound them from the intimacy of family life. Yet their obedience tethered them to one another with unbreakable bonds. For outsiders, the sight of a Templar initiation might have seemed stark, even severe. No gold or jewel adorned the mantle. No triumphant music filled the air. Instead, there was silence, humility, a solemnity that seemed almost otherworldly. Imagine watching as a man kneels, his voice steady as he vows to surrender all he has. The hush in the room is broken only by the murmur of prayer, the rustle of cloth as a mantle is laid upon him. It is not spectacle, but surrender. Over the centuries, myths grew like vines around this ritual. When the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, their enemies accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rites. The initiation ceremony, once simple, became painted with dark suspicion. Some said they spat on the cross, others that they worshipped strange idols, or swore loyalty through forbidden gestures. Yet, when we peel away the layers of accusation, what remains are the words recorded in the rule of the Templars, the testimonies of brothers, and the practices shared by other monastic orders. The ceremony was austere, Christian, and direct. The myths were weapons wielded against them, not mirrors of truth. For the knight himself, initiation marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. From that moment, his days were not his own. He would ride where commanded, fight when ordered, pray when called, and labor without question. His mantle was both privilege and burden. It offered him brotherhood and purpose, but demanded sacrifice beyond what most men would endure. Imagine him years later, gray now at the temples, still rising to the bell, still living by vows spoken in youth. The initiation was never truly finished. It echoed through every dawn and dusk of his remaining years. The symbolism of the initiation also extended into how the world perceived the Templars. To common folk, they were protectors of pilgrims, knights who lived not for glory but for service. To kings, they were both allies and rivals, rich, disciplined, and difficult to control. To the church, they were champions of faith, yet sometimes uncomfortably independent. And enemies, they were figures of awe, their white mantles with red crosses visible on battlefields like living symbols of devotion. The ceremony that produced and became, over time, the seed of legend. Yet, if you strip away the myths, what you find is simplicity. A small chapel, a circle of brothers, a man kneeling, speaking vows, a mantle draped, bread broken, prayers whispered. It was no grand spectacle, no hidden mystery. It was, instead, an affirmation that life was no longer lived for self but for God, for faith, for the order. The weight of the ritual was not in its secrecy, but in its constancy. As you step away from this imagined scene, you realize that the true power of the Templar initiation lay not in what appeared to outsiders, but in how it transformed insiders. It created unity, discipline, and an identity so strong that even centuries later, long after the order's suppression, people still speak of them with awe. Myths cling to their name. But at the heart of it all is a simple ceremony of vows, spoken in the flicker of candlelight, binding men together in devotion and sacrifice. The chapel falls silent once more, the candles burning low, the mantle draped across another pair of shoulders. The cycle repeats, generation after generation, until history itself carries a memory. And though myths distort and accusations darken, the essence remains, a ritual of humility, a brotherhood of discipline, a life surrender to faith. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Pompeii on a warm summer afternoon, nearly 2,000 years ago. The stone paving beneath your feet is worn smooth by countless footsteps. To your left, a baker's shop gives off the rich scent of bread, its oven still glowing from a morning's work. To your right, an open courtyard echoes with voices, the hum of a bustling Roman town alive with trade, laughter, and quarrels. Among these streets, not far from the central forum, lies a building that has stirred more fascination than most. The Lupanar, or brothel. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, the volcanic ash and pumice buried Pompeii in an instant of frozen time. Walls, streets, homes, and possessions were preserved, capturing a moment of Roman life more vividly than any text. Among the ruins, the Lupanar stands out, not simply for what it was, but for how completely it reveals the social and economic currents of its age. Step inside the building in your imagination. It is modest, 2 stories high, constructed of stone. The rooms are small, narrow, and dim. Each contains a simple bed made of masonry, one's covered with straw or cloth. The stone surfaces feel cold and unyielding. Comfort was not their purpose. The walls are decorated with frescoes, erotic scenes painted with bright colors, depicting acts that serve as both art and advertisement. These images function like a menu, allowing clients to point to their desire, bridging gaps of language in a city filled with travelers. The air is close, heavy with the scent of oil lamps, bodies, and wine. Voices echo in the cramped corridors. The building is practical, efficient, its layout designed for transaction rather than comfort. A narrow staircase connects the floors, and graffiti scrawled across the walls testifies to the lives and thoughts of those who pass through. Some inscriptions praise the charms of particular women. Others boast of exploits, and still others are simple names, carved to leave a trace of presence. The women who worked here were, for the most part, enslaved. They came from across the empire, often captured in war or sold into bondage. To them, the Lupanar was both prison and livelihood, their bodies commodities in an economy that treated them as property. Prices were low, often no more than the cost of a loaf of bread, making the services accessible to men of many classes. For the women, the work was unrelenting, the rooms cramped, privacy nearly non-existent. Imagine one of them, seated on the edge of a stone bed, the flicker of a lamp casting shadows on the frescoes around her. She waits, not for choice, but for inevitability. Yet, within this harsh reality lies a profound archaeological record. The Lupanar offers a direct glimpse into Roman attitudes towards sex, commerce, and social boundaries. Unlike later centuries, where such places were shrouded in secrecy, In Pompeii, they were integrated into the fabric of daily life. The brothel stood openly along a street, its frescoes visible, its presence acknowledged. Sexual commerce was not celebrated, but neither was it hidden. It was accepted as one thread in the tapestry of Roman society. The graffiti is particularly striking, scrawled in Latin, often crudely carved. It reveals voices otherwise lost to history. "I was here," one inscription declares. Another offers a kind of review, praising or mocking performance of a woman. Still others are playful or obscene. The jokes of clients long vanished, but still visible in scratch letters. These marks remind us that the building was not only a workplace, but a social space, where men spoke, boasted, and recorded themselves in stone. Imagine running your fingers across those faint letters, feeling the grooves left by hands nearly 2 millennia ago. The Lupanar also reflects the economic realities of Pompeii. Situated near the Forum, it was accessible to merchants, sailors, and travelers. Its low prices meant it catered not only to elites, but to ordinary men, laborers, soldiers, freedmen. This inclusivity reveals something about Roman society. Sexuality was commercialized, structured, and normalized. While elite Romans might cloak their indulgences in rhetoric, here it was plain and transactional. The preservation of this building allows us to see details that would otherwise be lost. The dimensions of rooms, the surviving plaster, the worn thresholds, all speak of use. The frescoes, though faded, still retain color. Their figures stylized yet vivid. They remind us that even in a place of exploitation, art adorned the walls. The Romans, pragmatic as they were, combined commerce with decoration, desire with display. As you linger in this imagined brothel, you sense the tension between fascination and discomfort. On the one hand, it is a place of survival for the women forced to work there, their lives bound by circumstance. On the other, it is a place that reveals without shame the realities of Roman urban life. Transactional, practical, and unhidden. The Lupanar was not extraordinary in its time. It was simply one among many. What makes it extraordinary now is its preservation, a snapshot of human desire, an economy sealed in ash. When we consider the Lupanar, we must balance myth with reality. It is tempting to see it only through the lens of scandal or prurience, to imagine it as exotic or shocking. Yet its existence was ordinary, integrated into the rhythms of Pompeii. The frescoes were advertisements, the graffiti casual chatter, the rooms workspaces. It was not hidden, but woven into the city like the baker's shop or the bathhouse. And so, as you step back into the street, the sunlight dazzling after the dimness of the brothel, you carry with you an understanding. The Lupanar of Pompeii is not simply a curiosity. It is a window into labor, economy, art, and human need. Preserved by disaster, it allows us to see what was once everyday, now made remarkable by survival. Imagine yourself lingering just outside the Lupanar, watching as men of different classes come and go. Their footsteps echo on the stones, blending with the constant hum of Pompeii's streets. Here, the lines between social ranks blur. A freedman with a few coins in his purse might find himself standing beside a sailor on leave, or even a wealthier patron passing through. Within those narrow rooms, status mattered little. Payment was an equalizer. This mingling of classes is part of what makes a Lupanar such a striking lens through which to view Roman society. To the Romans, sexuality was neither entirely private nor wholly public. It existed in an in-between space, openly acknowledged, yet carefully structured. Prostitution was legal, taxed, and regulated. Brothels like this one operated openly, their transactions woven into the city's economy. The women who worked here, however, had almost no power over their circumstances. Most were enslaved, their bodies bought and sold, their earnings claimed by owners. They came from across the empire, some perhaps from Gaul, others from the Greek world, still others taken from the East. Their diversity was reflected in the names scrawled in graffiti, sometimes Roman, sometimes foreign, sometimes simply nicknames. Step again into the building. The frescoes on the walls are vivid. Those centuries of ash have dimmed their brightness. They depict couples in various acts, stylized and idealized, meant less to arouse than to guide. For many clients, travelers, merchants, sailors, language was a barrier. These images offered a universal language of desire. Imagine a man pointing silently to a painting, indicating his choice, the transaction beginning with gesture rather than words. The frescoes function almost like a catalog, a practical tool dressed in artistic form. The graffiti tells its own story. One inscription reads, "Murtis delights many." Another boasts, "I had a good time here with Fortunata." Still others are humorous or self-mocking, recording encounters as though leaving reviews. Some clients carve their names alone, simply wishing to be remembered, if only in scratches on plaster. These inscriptions bridge centuries, offering us voices from the past that are rarely heard. They are not the words of emperors or poets, but of ordinary men in ordinary moments. Imagine running your hand across the wall, tracing those faint letters, and realizing you are touching the humor and boasting of someone who lived nearly 2 millennia ago. For archaeologists, the Lupanar is a treasure of information. It offers insight not only into sexuality, but into economics, language, and daily habits. The price is recorded, often a single coin, equivalent to the cost of a simple meal, reveal that sex was accessible across classes. The graffiti reveals literacy among ordinary men, enough at least to scratch a few words. The wearer threshold shows constant use, the erosion of stone by countless sandale feet. Each detail contributes to a fuller picture of life. The building's design was efficient. Narrow rooms lined a central corridor. Light came from small windows or from oil lamps, their smoke staining the walls. The beds of stone may seem harsh, but they were practical, durable, easy to clean, and covered with straw or cloth that could be replaced. Privacy was minimal. The sounds of voices, footsteps, and transactions carried easily through the hall. Imagine standing in one of those rooms as the door closes, the lamp sputtering, the fresco glowing faintly on plaster, the sense of confinement pressing in. The space was intimate but not comfortable, functional rather than luxurious. This contrast between function and fascination is striking. Today, the Lupanar is one of Pompeii's most visited sites. Tourists peer into the small rooms, marvel at the frescoes, and smile at the graffiti. Yet for those who lived and worked here, it was simply a workplace, harsh and unrelenting. The eruption of Vesuvius froze it in time, elevating what was ordinary into something extraordinary. The voices of the women are silent in the record, but the building itself testifies to their presence. What is perhaps most telling is how seamlessly the Lupanar fit into Pompeii. It was not hidden away in shame, but located near the Forum, close to taverns, baths, and markets. This placement reflects Roman pragmatism. Sexual commerce was acknowledged as part of urban life, a service like any other. Inscriptions elsewhere in Pompeii mention similar establishments, suggesting the Lupanar was not unique. It is only unique now because it survived so fully intact. As you step back into the imagined sunlight, you may feel a tension. On one hand, there is a sense of voyeurism, looking into lives shaped by exploitation. On the other, there is a historian's recognition that these walls preserve voices otherwise lost. The Lupanar is uncomfortable to confront, yet it is vital, reminding us that history is not only the story of elites and monuments, but of daily life in all its raw forms. The myths surrounding ancient sexuality often imagine it as wild and unrestrained, a constant indulgence. But the reality, as seen in Pompeii, was structured and ordinary, woven into routines of economy and survival. The Lupanar was not a palace of pleasure. It was a place of work, stark and transactional. Its preservation allows us to step into that reality, to feel its weight, and to acknowledge the humanity, exploited, ordinary, enduring, that once filled its narrow rooms. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing in the Lupanar, not as a visitor from the future, but as a client from the 1st century. The city outside is bustling, vendors calling out prices, wagons rumbling across stones, the shouts of children at play. But as you step through the doorway, the atmosphere shifts. The light grows dim, the air grows close, and the voices around you are different, lower, secretive, tinged with laughter or sighs. You are entering a space that is both public and private, ordinary and taboo. The very word Lupanar comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, a term used to describe prostitutes. The imagery is telling, animalistic, primal, yet woven into the fabric of the city. The Roman world did not shy away from acknowledging prostitution, but neither did it elevate it. It was seen as necessary, a service that kept desires contained. Yet those who worked here occupied one of the lowest rungs of society. Women in the Lupanar had little autonomy. Many were enslaved, their labor and bodies owned outright. Others were freed women, or poor women with no other means of survival. Regardless of origin, the stigma was lasting. Even if a woman gained her freedom, the memory of her work clung, marking her in the eyes of society. The conditions of life in the Lupanar were harsh. Imagine one of the small stone rooms as her world. Its bed of masonry topped with straw, the fresco above depicting acts she was expected to perform. Day after day, client after client, the room became not a space of rest but of endless repetition. Privacy was minimal and dignity scarce. The graffiti carved into walls that mocked or praised served as reminders of how little power she had over her image. And yet, within those same graffiti, her name, though written by others, was preserved, granting her a strange kind of immortality, denied to countless others of her station. The prices, as recorded in sources and inferred from graffiti, were shockingly low. Often a single coin sufficed, the cost of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. This reveals much about Roman society. To the men who entered, these women's labor was treated as cheap, abundant, and expendable. To the women, the coin was survival, though rarely theirs to keep. The economy of the Lupanar reflected both the wealth of Rome and the poverty of those at its margins. Imagine a hand exchanging a single bronze coin, the faint clink of metal, a transaction both casual and weighted with imbalance. For archaeologists, the Lupanar offers something almost unique, an unfiltered record of human intimacy in an ancient city. The frescoes show acts without euphemism, the graffiti record experiences without refinement, and the rooms themselves reveal the physicality of work. Unlike palaces or temples, preserved to honor the elite, the brothel shows the lives of those normally hidden from the historical record. It is, in many ways, more intimate than any villa, because it reveals daily realities stripped of grandeur. The art itself has drawn fascination for centuries. The frescoes, though stylized, are remarkable in their candor. Unlike later European art, which cloaked sexuality in allegory, these images were blunt. They did not pretend, but presented. Yet they were also practical, visual cues for a diverse clientele. Pompeii was a port town, and sailors, merchants, and travelers from across the empire passed through. Language barriers mattered little when desire could be pointed to on plaster. Imagine a man unable to speak Latin clearly, gesturing at a painted scene, and the transaction proceeding smoothly despite words failing. The frescoes were not just decoration, they were communication. The graffiti, too, deserve attention. Their voices from the margins, sometimes vulgar, sometimes playful, sometimes deeply human. One inscription declares satisfaction. Another mocks inadequacy. Another simply names a woman and praises her. Together, they form a record of interactions as immediate as any modern review scrawled online. The difference is that here, the voices have survived for nearly 2,000 years, etched into stone. To read them today is to hear ordinary men speaking across centuries, unpolished and raw. There's also an element of ritual within the brothel, though transactional. The act carried its own rhythms. Clients entered, paid, selected, and departed. Women worked, waited, endured. The building itself, with its narrow corridors and repeated rooms, mirrored this cycle. Each space a cell and a hive of labor. It was not chaos, but order, a structured part of urban life. The eruption of Vesuvius froze this order mid-motion, leaving us the stillness of what was once constant repetition. As you imagine standing in one of those rooms, the fresco above glowing faintly in lamplight, the weight of history presses differently. It is not the grandeur of empire, but the intimacy of survival, the reality of exploitation, and the ordinariness of transaction. The Lupanar strips away illusions about Rome's glory and reveals another truth, that the empire was built not only on marble and triumphs, but on the backs of those with little choice. And yet, paradoxically, the women of the Lupanar live on in history more vividly than many others. Their names scratched in walls, their labor recorded in fresco, their presence preserved in ash. They have voices, however faint. The very building that once marked their marginalization now ensures their memory. This irony deepens the mystery of the Lupaner. A place meant to be transient, forgotten, erased at dawn, is now immortal, studied, and remembered. Now let us step quietly into the Lupaner one last time, not to observe its transactions, but to reflect on its meaning. The rooms are empty in your imagination, the frescoes still bright, the graffiti still sharp, yet the sounds have faded. The footsteps, the murmurs, the laughter, the sighs. What remains is the echo of a world that lived and ended here, sealed forever by the eruption of Vesuvius. The brothel has fascinated visitors since the rediscovery of Pompeii in the 18th century. Early excavators, scandalized by its frescoes, sometimes locked them away in so-called secret cabinets, accessible only to male scholars and dignitaries. For centuries, the Lupaner was treated less as history and more as curiosity, evidence of Rome's supposed decadence. Yet as archaeology matured, scholars came to see it differently, not as a place of titillation, but as a vital record of urban life. The Lupaner reveals that sexuality, commerce, and survival were deeply intertwined in Roman society. Consider the stark contrast between the brothel and the grand villas of Pompeii. In the villas, walls were painted with mythological scenes, gods and heroes, landscapes and architecture. In the brothel, the frescoes were blunt, transactional, and immediate. Yet both are art, both expressions of Roman life. Together they remind us that history is never singular, but layered. Luxury and poverty, grandeur and necessity, all coexisting within a few streets of each other. The building also speaks to the resilience of human expression. Even in a space of exploitation, people left their marks. The graffiti etched into plaster may seem crude, but it is profoundly human. To carve one's name, to praise or mock, to record a fleeting encounter, these acts declare presence. They say, I was here, I lived, I mattered. For the enslaved women whose voices are otherwise silent, these marks, however filtered through clients, preserve fragments of identity. Imagine reading the faint scratch and name, your lips shaping syllables last spoken nearly 2 millennia ago. In that moment, the distance of time collapses. The Lupaner also invites reflection on the nature of memory. For the Romans, this building was ordinary. It was part of the urban landscape, accepted and unremarkable. But for us, preserved by disaster, it had become extraordinary. What they would have walked past without notice, we now treat as priceless evidence. History as a way of transforming the mundane into the remarkable, simply by survival. And there is the deeper paradox. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it. Without Vesuvius, the Lupaner would have vanished like countless others. Its walls crumbled, its frescoes faded, its graffiti erased by weather. Instead, it endured, sealed in ash, waiting for rediscovery. Disaster became preservation. Tragedy became testimony. Imagine the moment when early excavators first cleared the ash from its doorway, lanterns flickering on frescoes unseen for centuries. Shock, curiosity, and fascination must have mingled in equal measure. For modern visitors, walking through Lupaner can be unsettling. Some smile nervously, others gaze in fascination. Still others feel discomfort. These reactions mirror the complexity of the site itself. It is at once a place of art, economy, exploitation, and survival. To confront it is to confront the full spectrum of humanity: desire, power, resilience, and memory. The myths of Pompeii often dwell on decadence, painting the city as a place consumed by indulgence and punished by fate. But the Lupaner suggests something quieter. It was not a palace of pleasure, but a workplace, integrated into daily life. Its existence tells us less about decadence and more about pragmatism. Sex was commodified, regulated, and woven into the economy, treated as part of the ordinary flow of urban life. The myth of constant excess dissolves, replaced by a reality both harsher and more mundane. As you leave the building in your imagination, step once more into the bright streets of Pompeii. The hum of the forum returns. The smell of bread drifts again from ovens. The laughter of children carries on the air. Life continues, indifferent to brothel's shadow. And yet, you know that within those stone walls, countless stories unfolded. of women enduring, of men boasting, of names etched in haste. The Lupaner stands today not as scandal, but as witness. It testifies to the ordinary lives that made up the Roman world, lives rarely written in chronicles, yet preserved in plaster and stone. To walk its corridors is to walk alongside those voices, faint but insistent, reminding us that history is not only about emperors and battles, but also about the quiet, unrecorded rhythms of survival. And so, as segment 3 closes, you are left with a sense of paradox. The brothel was a place of exploitation, yet also a memory. It was ordinary in its time, yet extraordinary now. It was shaped by survival, preserved by disaster, and remembered by us. Like the myths of the Middle Ages or the vows of the Templars, it is a fragment of human history, layered, complex, and deeply human. Imagine yourself standing in Sparta, the sun casting sharp light across the rugged hills of Laconia. The air is dry, the ground firm beneath your feet, and all around you is a society unlike any other in the ancient Greek world. Here, life is shaped not by luxury or art, but by discipline, order, and the ever-present demand for strength. In Athens, poets sang and philosophers debated. In Sparta, the focus was survival, endurance, and the collective will of the polis. Even the most intimate part of life, marriage, was molded by this philosophy. Spartan marriage was not a private arrangement between two individuals or even between families alone. It was a state institution designed with one purpose above all others, to produce strong citizens. Every detail of the process reflected the priorities of society constantly preparing for war. Where in other Greek cities marriage might center on alliances, dowries, and household management, in Sparta it was a mechanism for preserving the strength of the community. The rituals themselves were unusual to outsiders. A young woman, often in her late teens, would be married to a man who had reached the age of 30. This age gap was deliberate, for Spartan men were required to live in communal barracks until that age, training constantly in the Goge, the rigorous military education that defined their youth. Marriage was postponed until they had proven themselves as warriors, disciplined and hardened by years of service to the state. The ceremony began with a symbolic act that struck even ancient observers as peculiar. The bride's head would be shaved, her hair cut short until she resembled a young man. She would then be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, awaiting her husband in a darkened room. This ritual, unsettling to modern sensibilities, carried symbolic meaning for the Spartans. It was thought to ease the transition for the groom, who, after years among male companions in the barracks, might find intimacy with a woman unfamiliar. The bride's androgynous appearance was a bridge between the world of comradeship and the world of family. When the groom arrived, he would perform a mock abduction. This, too, was ritualized. He would enter the room, lift his bride, and carry her away as though by force. Yet the act was not one of violence, but of symbolism, representing the shift from maidenhood to marriage. In a society that prized discipline, even the private union of man and woman was framed as an event of strength and transition. Yet, despite these rituals, Spartan marriages were far from conventional domestic arrangements. After the ceremony, the groom did not settle into a household with his wife. Instead, he returned to his barracks, continuing his life among fellow warriors. For years, the husband would visit his wife only in secret, slipping away at night to be with her before returning to his comrades by dawn. This secrecy was deliberate. It preserved the bond of soldiers, ensuring that marriage did not weaken the discipline of the barracks. At the same time, it allowed intimacy to grow slowly, tested by separation and anticipation. Imagine a Spartan man walking through the night, his steps silent, heart steady, approaching the small home where his wife waited in darkness. Their time together was fleeting, precious, and overshadowed by the call of duty. For Spartan women, this arrangement granted unusual freedom compared to their counterparts in other Greek cities. While Athenian women lived in seclusion, often confined to domestic spaces, Spartan women managed estates, oversaw property, and held authority in the absence of their husbands. With men occupied in training or on campaign, women ensured that the economy of the household, and indeed of the city, continued. They owned land, conducted business, and were expected to be physically strong themselves, exercising, training, and bearing children who would inherit the discipline of their parents. Imagine women in white tunics, running races or practicing with discus, their bodies strong and capable, their presence in public unremarkable. This visibility was shocking to outsiders, yet natural in Sparta. Marriage in Sparta was thus not primarily about affection, though bonds of love surely grew. It was about the continuation of the polis, the creation of strong citizens, and the maintenance of discipline. Even the peculiar rituals, the shaving of the bride's head, the cloak, the abduction, were expressions of this priority. They stripped away softness, emphasizing that marriage was not indulgence but duty. Over time, even the pairing of husband and wife was not left entirely to chance. The state, concerned with producing the healthiest children, sometimes sanctioned arrangements where men without heirs could allow their wives to bear children with other, stronger men. In a society where survival was paramount, reproduction was seen not as private choice but as public necessity. Such practices, strange to modern minds, reveal the extent to which personal life was subordinated to the needs of the community. As you stand in this imagined Sparta, watching the rituals unfold, you feel the weight of society where nothing, neither birth, marriage, nor death, escaped the shaping hand of the state. In this world, marriage was not a sanctuary from discipline, but an extension of it, binding individuals not only to each other, but to the destiny of the polis itself. Imagine, now, the life of a young Spartan woman preparing for marriage. From childhood, she had been taught differently than her Athenian cousins. She was not confined to the inner rooms of a household, weaving or learning silence. Instead, she trained her body alongside her brothers, running, wrestling, even throwing javelins. Her education included not only music and dance, but also strength, endurance, and discipline. For the Spartans believed that strong women bore strong children, and that motherhood was itself a form of service to the state. On the day of her marriage, she entered a ritual that was at once intimate and profoundly public. Her head was shaved, her hair cut short. In this moment, she shed the symbols of girlhood and assumed a new identity. She was dressed in a man's cloak, the heavy smelling of smoke and earth, a garment that spoke not of softness but of duty. She lay waiting in a darkened room, transformed into a figure both familiar and unfamiliar, part maiden, part comrade, part vessel of the city's future. The groom, 30 years old and hardened by years of military life, came here not as companion, but as an emissary of the state's will. His presence was shaped by secrecy. Though bound in marriage, he would not yet live openly with her. Their meetings would be furtive, stolen in the night. By day, he remained with his comrades, training, eating, and sleeping among them. By night, when chance allowed, he came to her, their union hidden from the eyes of others. The secrecy carried purpose. It kept him bound to the barracks, to discipline, and to his brothers in arms, even as it allowed marriage to take root. Imagine the rhythm of their life together. The wife managed the estate, overseeing fields, slaves, and household goods. She was not merely a caretaker, but an authority in her own right. When her husband was away, which was often, she ensured the land produced, the house thrived, and the family endured. Her voice carried weight in the community, and her independence astonished outsiders. Spartan women could own land, inherit wealth, and manage affairs, powers denied to most women in Greece. This independence made them both admired and criticized. Their voice is stronger than expected in a world that prized female silence elsewhere. For the husband, marriage did not lessen his duty to the state. His life remained one of endurance. He ate simple meals in the mess halls, trained with his spear, and answered the call of his commanders. His wife was not a refuge from discipline, but a partner in its purpose. Their union was measured not by affection alone, but by its contribution to the polis, by the children produced and the strength it preserved. Over time, intimacy grew. The secrecy of their meetings lent them intensity. The fleeting hours together heightened by the knowledge of dawn's separation. In this, Spartan marriage held a paradox. It was both restricted and strengthened by discipline. Love, when it came, was forged in scarcity, tested in endurance. Imagine the quiet of a Spartan home at night, the flicker of an oil lamp, the sound of hushed voices as husband and wife spoke of fields, of family, of the uncertain future. Their connection was fragile, yet it endured, strengthened by the rhythm of distance and return. To outsiders, these practices seemed strange, even harsh. Greek writers often remarked on the boldness of Spartan women, their physical strength, their public voices, their independence. Some admired them, others mocked them, but within Sparta, this was necessity. With men constantly at war or in training, women carried the weight of economic and domestic life. They were not hidden but essential, their roles acknowledged even if not fully equal. The state's involvement in marriage extended even further. If a man was deemed weak or infertile, arrangements could be made for his wife to bear children with another, stronger man. This practice shocked outsiders, but to Spartans it was pragmatic. The health of the community outweighed personal pride. Reproduction was not a private matter but a public duty, bound by the same logic that shaped every Spartan life. The survival and strength of the polis. This blending of public duty and private life made Spartan marriage unique. It was not about romance, though love could grow. It was not about wealth, though estates mattered. It was about service, about producing the next generation of warriors and mothers who would sustain the city's ideals. In this sense, the wedding night was less a personal milestone than a civic one, a continuation of the discipline that defined every Spartan path. As you picture this world, you sense the contrast with other Greek cities. In Athens, women were secluded, marriage was domestic, and love was often separated from duty. In Sparta, love and duty were fused, each marriage a small thread in the fabric of collective survival. Nothing was untouched by the needs of the state, not even the most private of unions. And so, in this imagined scene, the Spartan couple sits in darkness. Their lives are bound together, not by feasting or festivity, but by shaved hair cloaks secrecy and silence. Their marriage is at once austere and powerful, a reflection of society where even love was molded into the shape of discipline. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Sparta on a bright morning. Around you, women move confidently, their steps purposeful. Some head to the fields, overseeing laborers. Others gather in groups, conversing with voices clear and unafraid. Their presence in public life is striking, especially when compared with women of other Greek cities. This independence was born not from indulgence, but from necessity. Spartan men were bound to military service, often absent from their homes. The women, therefore, carried responsibilities that elsewhere would belong to men. Marriage, in this context, was less about domestic retreat and more about partnership in survival. The wife did not wait quietly for her husband's return. She managed estates, controlled wealth, and made decisions. This authority was recognized by law and custom. A Spartan woman could inherit land and was among the wealthiest landholders in Greece. Some accounts suggest that by the 4th century BCE, women controlled nearly 2/5 of Spartan property. This was not because of generosity, but because of the practical demands of the system. When husbands lived in barracks and marched to war, someone had to hold the reins of household and land. Imagine a Spartan wife overseeing the harvest. Her husband is away on campaign, his spear raised against distant foes. She walks through the fields, inspecting crops, giving orders, ensuring that the estate prospers. Her authority is not questioned. It is expected. Her role is not ornamental but functional, as essential to the polis as the hoplite shield. This independence, though born of necessity, gave Spartan women a voice unique in the Greek world. The children of this union were also shaped by discipline. From birth, infants were examined by elders. If deemed weak or unfit, they might be abandoned, an act shocking to us, but consistent with a Spartan belief in collective strength. Those who survived entered a life of training. Boys were taken at the age of 7 into the agoge, molded into warriors through hardship. Girls, too, were trained, though less harshly, in physical exercise to ensure they would grow into strong mothers. Thus, marriage was not merely about companionship, but about producing children who embodied the state's ideals. The secrecy of Spartan marriages added another layer of complexity. Husbands visited wives at night, slipping away from the barracks. This arrangement reinforced the primacy of the collective over the individual. The man belonged first to Sparta, second to his family. Yet paradoxically, this distance could deepen bonds. Meetings were brief, hidden, and precious. Each visit was marked by anticipation, each separation by endurance. Imagine the quiet knock at a door in the dark, the whispered greeting, the fleeting hours of intimacy before dawn called him back to his comrades. Love in this world was not daily comfort but rare fire, burning brightly in scarcity. Spartan women, aware of their central role, developed reputations for boldness. Ancient writers recorded sayings attributed to them, sharp and fearless. One mother, handing her son his shield, told him, "Return with it or on it." Such words revealed the ethos of Sparta, where even affection was bound to discipline, and love was inseparable from duty. Marriage produced not only children, but warriors and mothers who sustained this ethic. At the same time, the state sometimes intervened directly in reproduction. If a marriage produced no children, or if the husband was seen as weak, arrangements could be made for the wife to conceive with another man. This practice unsettled outsiders, who saw it as a violation of marital sanctity. But for Spartans, the collective outweighed the personal. The aim was strong offspring, not romantic exclusivity. Marriage, then, was less about possession and more about function, another expression of the state's relentless pragmatism. Imagine the conversations such practices might spark. A wife, strong and independent, is told she may bear a child with a man other than her husband. The decision is not framed as betrayal, but as duty, a contribution to the polis. Her husband, though perhaps uneasy, accepts the logic, for his loyalty is first to Sparta. In this, we glimpse a society where even the most intimate bonds were reshaped by collective necessity. To outsiders, all of this seemed harsh, even alien. Athenian commentators mocked Spartan women for their freedom, their physical training, and their sharp tongues. They viewed Spartan marriage as cold, stripped of poetry and affection. Yet within Sparta, these practices were coherent, reflecting values of endurance, equality and necessity, and survival above all. The rituals, the secrecy, the pragmatism, all made sense in a world constantly prepared for war. As you walk again through the imagined streets, you notice how marriage is not hidden behind walls, but visible in the strength of women, the discipline of men, and the vigor of children. It is not a private contract, but a public foundation. The household is not separate from the state, but an extension of it. In every marriage, the polis sees itself reflected, renewed, and sustained. Thus, Spartan marriage was more than a union of two people. It was a union of personal life with civic purpose, of intimacy with survival, of love with discipline. It reveals a society where the line between private and public blurred until almost invisible, where even the most personal acts were framed in service to the collective. Imagine, at last, the later years of a Spartan marriage. The husband, no longer a young warrior, has survived countless campaigns. His body bears scars of battle, his hair touched with gray. The wife, strong in her own right, has managed estates for decades, guided children into adulthood, and spoken with authority in the community. Their bond, forged in secrecy and discipline, has matured into something enduring. What began as a ritual of shaved hair, a cloak, and a mock abduction has become a partnership built on shared service to Sparta. The rhythm of their lives was still marked by the needs of the state. Even in age, men could be called to fight, and women remained guardians of households. Yet, in these later years, the couple shared more openly. As men left the barracks at 35 and eventually retired from constant campaigning, husbands could finally live more regularly with their wives. Marriage, once hidden in night visits, became a daily presence. Imagine the relief of this change. No longer brief, secret encounters, but shared meals, conversations at dusk, the quiet companionship of two lives joined after long endurance. By this stage, their children had entered the cycle of Spartan discipline. Sons were in the agoge, molded into warriors by hardship, while daughters trained their bodies, preparing to become mothers of the next generation. The couple's union was visible in their offspring, living embodiments of Spartan ideals. Their love, if it had grown, was expressed not through tenderness, but through pride in children who carried the discipline forward. The legacy of Spartan marriage was not affection in the Athenian sense, adorned with poetry and plays. It was duty. It was a quiet pride of mothers who sent sons to war, of fathers who entrusted wives with land and authority. It was the understanding that their lives were not entirely their own, but belonged to the polis. Imagine the farewell at a city gate, a wife watching her husband march once more with a shield, knowing she might not see him again. Her grief was real, but so was her acceptance, shaped by a lifetime of discipline. Ancient writers left us glimpses of this ethos. Plutarch recorded sayings of Spartan women that captured their spirit. Only with a shield or on it, they told their sons, meaning return victorious or return dead. To them, marriage was not about protection from hardship, but about preparing one another for it. Husbands and wives shared in this ethos equally, bound together by necessity and statecraft. This blending of private and public meant that Spartan marriages contributed directly to the city's power. The strength of its warriors, the resilience of its women, the health of its children, all traced back to unions structured not for romance but for survival. And yet, within these constraints, human affection still found space. Love may not have been the purpose, but neither was it absent. In the quiet of the night, in whispered words, in shared glances across years of endurance, couples built connections as real as any in history. Imagine an older Spartan couple sitting outside their home at twilight. The day's work is done, the fields tended, the voices of children echo in the distance. The husband's spear leans against the wall. The wife's hands rest on her lap. They do not speak much. Spartans value brevity, but their silence carries depth. They have lived a marriage shaped by discipline, by secrecy, by duty, and by sacrifice. It is not a romance sung by poets, but it is a bond tempered by resilience. For us, looking back, Spartan marriage is both alien and illuminating. Alien, because its rituals and practices challenge our expectations of intimacy and love. Illuminating, because it shows how deeply a society can shape even the most personal of human bonds. Where Athens celebrated beauty and philosophy, Sparta celebrated strength and endurance, and marriage reflected this difference. As you leave this imagined Sparta, you carry with you a sense of its paradox. Spartan marriage was harsh, pragmatic, even unsettling, yet it also produced women of independence, men of discipline, and bonds forged in endurance. It reminds us that love and intimacy are not constants across cultures, but expressions of values, shaped by the demands of survival. And so segment 4 closes, not with a tender wedding feast or romantic verse, but with the quiet strength of two lives joined by duty, discipline, and resilience. Their story, like the vows of the Templars or the walls of Pompeii, reveals a truth about humanity, that even when shaped by necessity, even when disciplined by the state, the bond between people endures, different, yet still deeply human. Imagine yourself settling once more into stillness, the journey now complete. We have wandered across centuries, passing through myth and truth, through vows whispered in stone chapels, through brothels hidden beneath volcanic ash, through marriages bound not by affection, but by the demands of the state. Each stop has revealed a fragment of human life, familiar in some ways, foreign in others, reminding us that history is layered, fragile, and often misunderstood. We began in the so-called Dark Ages, a period long caricatured as a time of ignorance, dirt, and superstition. Popular imagination insisted that people thought the world was flat, that medicine was mere superstition, and that torture devices lurked in every dungeon. Yet, when we paused on those cobble streets, the picture changed. Scholars quietly charted the heavens and taught that the earth was round. Physicians applied herb surgery and surprising skill. Peasants carried laughter, song, and resilience into their days. The myths dissolved, and in their place appeared the complexity of real lives. Lives with hardship, yes, but also knowledge and faith. From there, we entered the austere world of the Knights Templar. Legend had made them guardians of secret treasures, accused them of hidden rituals, even whispered of heresy. But within the candlelit silence of their chapels, the truth was simpler. Men pledged themselves to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their initiation bound them not to glory or wealth, but to discipline, to the brotherhood of their order, to service larger than the self. Power did not spring from secrecy, but from the quiet act of surrender. Then we turned south, into preserved stillness of Pompeii. Beneath the ash of Vesuvius, the Lupanar offered vision of life both ordinary and extraordinary. Its narrow rooms, stone beds, erotic frescoes, and graffiti captured voices rarely preserved in history. The voices of women who labored, of men who purchased, of strangers leaving their marks on plaster. The brothel was not unique in its own time, but disaster transformed it into a window through which we still peer today. There we saw survival, exploitation, commerce, and humanity all sealed together in ash. Finally, we walked into Sparta, a city where even marriage bent to the will of the polis. Brides shed their hair, donned men's cloaks, and waited in darkened rooms. Husbands, still tied to their comrades in barracks, visited them only at night. Women held authority over estates and property, carrying a boldness that startled other Greeks. Love was not the aim. Endurance was. Marriage was a civic duty, a way of producing strong children, a ritual of service to the community. What outsiders looked harsh was, within Sparta, coherent, a reflection of values that place survival above all else. Taken together, these stories show us that history rarely fits the myths built around it. Myths simplify and distort. They painted the Middle Ages as a pit of ignorance, the Templars as sinister conspirators, Pompeii as decadent, Sparta as heartless. Yet, when we lingered, we saw nuance. We saw peasants with knowledge, knights with humility, women of Pompeii whose lives are preserved in stone, Spartan couples forging quiet bonds despite the demands of the state. We saw people imperfect, enduring, human, shaped by the worlds they inhabited. And perhaps, as you sit in quiet now, the effect of this journey feels steadying. Myths that once seemed imposing soften when we glimpse the truths beneath. History, approached gently, does not overwhelm with drama. It whispers. It speaks with patience, showing that even in the harshest centuries, people sought laughter, meaning, discipline, and love. This is why history soothes. It reminds us that our struggles are not unique, that resilience has always existed, that joy has flickered even in difficulty. The peasants who worked the soil, the knights who surrendered their will, the women of Pompeii, the couples of Sparta, all lived lives of endurance, marked by forces larger than themselves, yet filled with moments of humanity. Now, as the story closes, you can let those myths and truths drift together in your mind, like candle smoke curling upward into stillness. The past is spoken softly, steadily, and its voice is enough to carry you into calm. Picture the quiet glow of a medieval hearth, the flicker of candles in a Templar chapel, the dim corridors of Pompeii, the twilight of Spartan streets. They are all silent now, preserved only in memory and story. Yet through them, you have walked unhurried, safe, guided by the rhythm of their lives. History, like sleep, unfolds in layers. Myths on the surface, truths just beneath, and deeper still the pulse of humanity. Tonight you have wandered through those layers. And now, you may let them go. Rest with the knowledge that though the past was harsh, it was also human. Rest in the certainty that myths fade, but humanity endures. Rest and let the silence of history ease you into sleep.